Not long after Marx died, Engels wrote that it is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement, the question of free love comes to the foreground. I'm going to give you an overview of how sexuality has been weaponized politically, looking in particular at how the twin aims of population control and the promotion of sexual degeneracy are linked. In his 1791 novel, Justine, the Marquis de Sade showed how sexual radicalism leads to political revolution. Justine suffers because she doesn't recognize that God is evil and wickedness is the source of human activity. Her sister, Juliette, thrives because she delights in evil. 4 years afterwards, heads rolled in the French Revolution as de Sade watched and cheered. But after Napoleon abdicated, the radicals went underground, where they continued to work on destabilizing the family as the fundamental social unit. They had two aims: population control and the destruction of Christianity. Both are connected because God told man to be fruitful and multiply. As Marx said, the secret to the Holy Family is the earthly family. To make the former disappear, the latter must be destroyed, in theory and in practice. In 1798, Thomas Robert Malthus claimed the birth rate had to be reduced. Population growth, he feared, would outstrip food production, and the elites, naturally, believed they should decide who should live and who should die. Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, called the Irish potato famine of the 1840s an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. In France, in the 1830s and 1840s, Charles Fourier's ideas were influencing the socialist movement, and his ideas on the family were made widely available with the publication of the first volume of his complete works in 1841. He believed monogamy was an institution contrary to human nature, and hence an impediment to human happiness, so he wanted latitude for the sexual passions, including orgies. Children would be raised communally. Society would be one big family. It's interesting, by the way, to note how frequently socialism is linked to sexual permissiveness. Bertrand Russell, for example, who liked to talk about the shining society of the future that socialism would bring about, refused to stay faithful to his wife, even in old age. In Britain, the utopian socialist Robert Owen, writing around the same time, believed communities of 500 to 2,000 people would take the place of the family. This would bring about the socialist revolution. And Owen stressed the importance of education. Children had to be removed from the dangerous influence of parents to shape them to fit the revolutionary agenda. Remember, the Nazis banned homeschooling, and they were the National Socialists. A few decades later, prominent socialist elites championed eugenics. George Bernard Shaw, for example, said that if we desire a certain type of civilization and culture, we must exterminate the sort of people who do not fit into it. And H.G. Wells advocated the extermination of the vicious, helpless and pauper masses, the weak and silly and pointless. During the Russian Revolution, Alexandra Kollontai, the first woman on the St. Petersburg Revolutionary Council and Commissar for Public Welfare under Lenin, then attacked the family. She legalized divorce and abortion, established communal houses, and promoted free love. The home fire, she wrote, is going out in all classes. and strata of the population, and of course, no artificial measures will fan its fading flame. Kollontai was implementing the ideas of Auguste Bebel, who'd been heavily influenced by Fourier. It is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement, the question of free love comes to the foreground. As E. Michael Jones has put it, sexual revolution is the political mobilization of sexual vice. Meanwhile, in the US, in 1921, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, which openly advocated eugenics for racist purposes. This would later be renamed Planned Parenthood. Mary Stopes also opened a birth control clinic in London in 1921. And in the 1927 Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, the justices legalized sterilization of undesirable citizens. The Frankfurt School was founded in 1923. Originally conceived as the Institute for Marxism, it was renamed the Institute for Social Research to be more subtle. All three of Marx's main predictions had not just failed, but the opposite of them had occurred. The proletariat had shrunk and become richer, the middle class had grown and become richer, and so had the upper class. So the Frankfurt School aimed at translating Marxism from economic to cultural terms, seeing the family as the most important institution to infiltrate. Remember what Marx said, "The secret of the Holy Family is the earthly family. To make the former disappear, the latter must be destroyed, in theory and in practice." Also in 1923, Magnus Hirschfeld, who developed the theory that the binary gender system must be abolished, founded the Institute for Nudism. Understanding how media could change culture, he also produced and performed in the first homosexual film, different from the others. In 1928, he went on to found the World League for Sexual Reform, and 1928 saw two other related events. First, John Watson published his book, Psychological Care of Infant and Child, which sought to replace parental love and traditional standards of child rearing with scientific behavioral control. Each human being, he believed, was a malleable object that could be conditioned. Because people were less and less formed by and tied to religion, tradition, and morality, they could and needed to be reconditioned. And the younger the person, the more this would succeed. Second, Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud and the great-uncle of the co-founder of Netflix, Mark Bernays Randolph, wrote his work Propaganda. He described manipulating mass opinion as the engineering of consent. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, he wrote, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? Its first chapter begins like this. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind. Bernays knew that without God, chaos would reign. Salvation depended on the elites. Accordingly, the behaviorist Bernard Berelson, funded by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, developed the techniques of mass manipulation even further, using radio and television. But there was a problem. Kollontais reforms had caused havoc in Russia. Starving women and children, no longer protected by alimony laws requiring men to support them, were supporting themselves with prostitution. The men who drafted Kollontais reforms were shot. Homosexuality restrictions were reinstated. Abortions were made more difficult. Asceticism returned to undermine attempts to sexually enlighten children. Divorce laws were reintroduced. The family was supported again. Communal child rearing stopped. Authoritative schooling returned. Yet the West didn't heed the warning. In the 1930s, the Rockefellers funded Sanger's birth control agenda to solve mass poverty during the Great Depression, and Wilhelm Reich watched the backlash in the Soviet Union in frustration from Germany. He'd wanted Russia to be a model utopia. He knew the sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process, and he believed 3 orgasms a week would build a classless society. It didn't matter at all how people produced those orgasms. The patriarchal family, he wrote in The Sexual Revolution, 1936, is the structural and ideological breeding ground of all social orders based on the authoritarian principle. Linking this authoritarian principle to God, he said, "We do not discuss the existence or non-existence of God. We merely eliminate the sexual repressions and dissolve the infantile ties to the parents." Remember, the earthly family is the key to the holy family. The sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process. He aimed at destroying the sex-negating atmosphere and structure of the family by harnessing the fact that revolutionary youth is hostile and destructive to the family. This was his development of Freud's ideas that religion, morality, and parental authority are repressive, especially sexually. And Freud's ideas were themselves developments of Engels's fantasy vision of the first civilizations prior to private property and patriarchy as promiscuous communes. There's no evidence for this. Private property and the family have existed for as long as human beings have. But Marx, Engels, Wilhelm Reich and the others weren't really interested in evidence. It is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement, the question of free love comes to the foreground. After World War II, the German authoritarian character was blamed for the Holocaust. Germany had to be re-educated, and the only way to do that was for the family to be destroyed. A liberated sexuality, free of compulsory marriage, the incest taboo, and prohibition of paedophilia was openly practiced in Berlin at Commune 1 and Commune 2. The media covered it extensively, and anti-authoritarian schooling and parenting were pursued. Around this time, Alfred Kinsey's work also contributed to this sexual radicalism. A homosexual sadomasochist, he published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948. His main aim was to attack the father as the figurehead of the patriarchal family. "The whole of our laws and customs in sexual matters," he wrote, "is based on the avowed desire to protect the family, and at the base of the family is the father. His behavior is revealed by the Kinsey report to be quite different from anything the general public had supposed reasonable or possible." Financed by you guessed it, the Rockefeller Foundation, he aimed at making deviant sexual behavior appear normal. This included using data on orgasms in children and babies collected by a paedophile. In 1951, however, the American Statistical Society discredited Kinsey's data, but his report was still distributed with the aid of the New York Times. Now, although the Rockefellers had withdrawn funding after the report was subjected to a congressional investigation, Hayes Sulzberger, the publisher of the newspaper, was on the board of, wait for it, the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1949, the year after Kinsey's work on male sexuality, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. She described pregnancy as mutilation, calling the fetus a parasite and nothing like flesh. Proud of her 2 abortions, de Beauvoir set up an abortion station in her Paris salon, despite it being prohibited. Like many other leading French intellectuals, she also signed a petition to legalize pedophilia by totally abolishing the age of consent. Kinsey then wrote Sexual Behavior in The Human Female in 1953. In all its 842 pages, it didn't contain a single reference to motherhood. Herbert Marcuse, funded by the Rockefellers, heightened Kinsey's destabilizing impact by developing Reich's idea of sexual liberation. The utopian society, Marcuse argued, would be organized around pleasure. His book Eros and Civilization, 1955, saw the deepest cause of repressive power relationships as the suppression of Eros, and this vision inspired the hippies of the 1960s. The sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process. Playboy, rock music, and porn promoted the pleasure principle further, aided by the Tavistock Institute. According to Dr. John Coleman, former British Secret Service, when Michael Jackson bought the Beatles songs, outbidding Paul McCartney, he discovered Theodore Adorno owned almost all of their music and lyrics because he had written them. Now, who was Adorno? From 1949, Adorno had been a prominent teacher at the Frankfurt School, originally called, remember, the Institute for Marxism, and focused on subverting culture. From 1958, he had been the Institute's director. Adorno died in 1969, shortly after the Abbey Road album, and the Beatles broke up in 1970. Coleman's claim might seem preposterous, but appealing to ridicule is a fallacy, and many singers have had all or most of their work written for them. Elvis, for example, Elton John, and the Tavistock Institute helped develop the Grateful Dead. Alan Trist, a social engineer for the Tavistock Institute and the son of Eric Trist, one of Tavistock's founding members, was their shadow manager. The Grateful Dead were heavily involved in the promotion of LSD, encouraging the counterculture, breaking free from society, what Marcuse called the Great Refusal. There's a link here to the style of music. By 1923, Schoenberg had developed free atonality, which he'd been experimenting with, into 12-tone composition, describing it as a way of breaking free of what the ear had gradually become acquainted with. And Adorno called 12-tone the predominance of dissonance. For him, it meant attacking order. And Womack and Cox note how the aura of Schoenberg's atonality coloured a number of interludes and passages in the Beatles, very much in keeping with the 12-tone pitch matrix system fostered by Schoenberg. Significantly, the only composer on the cover of Sgt. Pepper is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who'd worked at an electronic music studio in Cologne, focused on developing Schoenberg's serialism through new degrees of control made possible by electronic instruments and the tape recorder. His goal was to invest electronic music with a religious spirituality. As Plato's Socrates says, rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul on which they mightily fasten. Now let's suppose that you find Dr. John Coleman's claim about Adorno and the Beatles absurd. But Aleister Crowley, regarded as a Satanist during his lifetime and fond of eating his own excrement, is also on the album cover of Sgt. Pepper. And Charles Manson claimed he got his inspiration from the Beatles and wrote their lyrics in blood on the walls of his victim Sharon Tate's house. While the Beatles broke free from all accepted rules of music, the hippies made free love. And John Money opened the first clinic for sex change operations in the early 1960s, the Gender Identity Clinic. Like Kinsey, Money promoted sexual deviance. For him, even sex murder was just a different preference. He advocated sex games for children. It is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement, the question of free love comes to the foreground. The sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process. Money based his clinic on an experiment with a pair of twin brothers. After a botched circumcision, one of the twins, Bruce Reimer, had sex reassignment surgery and became Brenda. With Money's guidance, his parents raised him as a girl for 10 years, but he was always troubled and decided to live as a boy after discovering what had happened to him. At age 38, he shot himself with a shotgun, 2 years after his twin brother, Brian, had overdosed. Remember that promoting sexual deviance and population reduction go together. President Johnson, in his January 4th, 1965 State of the Union address, said, "I will seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity in world resources." In the same year, Sanger achieved her life's goals. The US Supreme Court declared laws against birth control unconstitutional. And in the same year too, the Eli Landau Holocaust porn film, The Pawnbroker, broke Section 7, Subsection 2 of the Motion Picture Production Code, which was one of Hollywood's last remaining taboos. Deep Throat and The Devil in Miss Jones followed in 1973. Writing in 1974, Andrea Dworkin believed children are fully capable of participating in community and have every right to live out their own erotic impulses. So she hoped that the distinctions between children and adults, and the social institutions which enforce those distinctions, would disappear as androgynous community develops. Marcuse, funded by the Rockefellers, had also envisioned such a society of polymorphous perversity. And David Thorstad, the former president of the Gay Activists Alliance, which opposed age of consent laws from its inception in 1969, wrote that boy lovers were involved in the gay movement from the beginning, and their presence was tolerated. In 1975, a gay rights conference in Sheffield backed a motion in favour of paedophilia. The Guardian covered it, writing, "Child lovers win fight for role in gay lib." In 1979, the inaugural issue of the Gay Community News published a statement to the gay liberation movement on the issue of man-boy love that argued for the sexual free expression of children. Labour Deputy Leader Harriet Harman, who introduced the Equality Act 2010, worked at the National Council for Civil Liberties in the 1970s, and the Paedophile Information Exchange was affiliated to it. PI's aim was normalising sex with children as the sexual liberation of children. It campaigned for children's sexuality and received invitations from student unions, won sympathetic media coverage, and found academics willing to push its message. On at least 2 occasions, the Campaign for Homosexual Equality Conference passed motions in PI's favour. PI argued there should be no age of consent. Love is love, paedophiles argue, leads logically to the protection of all sexual orientations, and no queer theorist has ever argued against them. Perhaps the most famous, Michel Foucault, raped little boys in Tunisia. In Germany, the Green Party was still attempting to legalise paedophilia in the 1980s and 1990s. In 1985, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, whose journal countercultural poet Allen Ginsberg wrote for, became a member of New York's Council of Lesbian and Gay Organizations, as well as the International Gay Association, now the International Lesbian and Gay Association, ILGA. This lost ILGA its NGO status in the UN. ILGA tried to regain it in April 2002, but was refused because it didn't prove it had purged paedophile groups. The Washington Times reported that the Pakistani delegate to the UN Economic and Social Council expressed concern. For more than a year, the ILGA has refused to provide documentation or allow review of its membership list to demonstrate that paedophile groups have been expelled. In 2014, the German Ethics Council called for incest between siblings to be decriminalised, and tolerance for minor attracted persons is still being called for today. It is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement, the question of free love comes to the foreground. The sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process. The promotion of the LGBTQ movement contributes to population reduction. Only heterosexuals can reproduce. And this is a symptom of falling civilizations. As the Roman Empire fell, for example, its cities abounded with male prostitutes, so common had homosexuality and bisexuality become. And sodomy was also a popular method of birth control. But abortion, justified by Plato and Aristotle, was common. The excavation of a villa at Ashkelon found the remains of 100 newborn babies thrown into a sewer. Today, promoting abortion is the solution to heterosexual reproduction. Britain, for example, would meet the replacement fertility rate if it weren't for the 200,000 yearly abortions. The UN expects the fertility rate to fall below replacement level in 3 out of 4 developing countries by 2050, and the goal of zero carbon ultimately means zero people. In 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation, so active throughout all the events outlined so far, intently focused on population reduction, birth control, behaviorism, and sexual radicalism, funding Sanger, Berelson, Kinsey, and Marcuse, published Scenario for the Future of Technology and International Development. An article entitled Lockstep outlined how a pandemic in the future overwhelmed the world and led to tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership that gave national leaders more latitude to impose order in ways they saw fit. This is the revolutionary dream and delusion From chaos, order. It is a peculiar fact that with every great revolutionary movement the question of free love comes to the foreground. Why? Sex, probably the most powerful human motivator, is weaponized to uproot people from religion and family. With their moral and social bonds thus dissolved, people become atomized. And atomized people, led by their passions, are easier to manipulate in accordance with an agenda epitomized by Marx's favourite line from Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust: "Everything that exists deserves to perish."